So this piece is the architectural piece called the Church of Saint Foy, and it is made up of 4 images from College Board and basically 2 separate really images. One is going to be about the church and the church interior, and then the other image is going to have to do with the reliquary, which you're seeing in the lower right-hand image. So I'm going to start off talking to you about context first and making sure you are okay with that before we move on to content. So for context, the biggest thing to know is about the time period we're in. Romanesque art means Roman-like. So we're going to see a lot of characteristics that are very Roman inspired. But the biggest thing has to do with the date. So in the second bullet, you'll see that I talk about the year 999 ACE and the change to the year 1000 ACE. So imagine, December 31st, 1999, and the Christians who were living in that time really did think perhaps the world was going to end in that change of the new year. So preparations were made, fears were definitely intense. And when it did not end in the next day, they felt the need to give thanks. And so in this time period you have after 1000 ACE, when really Romanesque art begins, you've got a huge amount of church building as a thanks to God for not ending the world, basically. And you have a lot of journeys going on to these famous and important religious sites. And that is also to give thanks. And those religious journeys are called pilgrimages. And the people who take them are called pilgrims. And it's a concept you see in all sorts of different faiths. And we will be addressing different pilgrimage sites throughout the world and throughout our timeline. So the Church of Saint Foy is a pilgrimage church on the route to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, which was a famous pilgrimage destination. I think it's the burial site of St. James. You can still go on that pilgrimage to this day. And so our church here is in France, and it was one of the stops along that famous pilgrimage route. So that's part one, and it's an incredibly important part of any Romanesque context in any pieces we do in Romanesque art that is religious in focus. Now, the second part of context has to do with who Saint Foy is. Now, she was a young girl from the Roman time period before really Christianity was fully embraced. And she's in France, and it was a Roman-occupied France in her lifetime. And she refused, when asked, to sacrifice to the pagan gods like Neptune and Jupiter and that. And she was only 12 years old when she's asked to do this. And when she refuses, then over and over, she then is killed for that refusal and for her Christian beliefs. So she is considered then a martyr. And a martyr definitely is someone who dies for their religious beliefs. So her remains we're going to talk about those when we talk about the reliquary coming up. But this church, then, the reason pilgrims come to this church is to visit her remains and to honor her, this martyr who gives up her life for her beliefs. So it's an important symbolic kind of quality here in this piece. Now, the thing that kind of makes me laugh about this a little bit is that the monks who inhabit this church. So the church was here on this site, and then there was a monastery also on the grounds. And so the monks who live in that monastery in France here, they steal this item, this reliquary with her remains, Saint Foy's remains, from another monastery and bring it to their own in the hopes that pilgrims will stop and make this site a stop along their pilgrimage route, and it'll bring in more money and interest to their church. So that's a bit interesting when you associate that with this religious space. So that really is our context. I'm going to go into the specifics now about the piece, starting with the exterior. Okay, So first of all, Romanesque churches are going to have Roman features. So you should see throughout, if you're just looking at the facade or the front here, and this is the front of the narthex, so that entrance and exit, you see a lot of Roman arches. The windows, the openings there, they are all Roman inspired. Romanesque churches tend to be very solid, so you're not going to see a lot of openings, not a lot of windows, nor are you going to see a lot of architectural detail, like ornamental, like sculpture work on the church. And you don't see that here. It's pretty solid kind of stonework, and that's it. And there's a reason for that, and that's because the churches are much taller, and you have to have a big wide nave in order to fit all the pilgrims in. So we don't have the architectural technology yet to make the nave wide and put a lot of windows in at the same time. We can't. So our walls have to be very thick, not a lot of openings in order to support that. So that's why you see a lot of solid walls here, not a lot of openings. The two towers up at the top that I'm pointing to with that kind of magenta colored arrow are called Westwork Towers. They are basically tall towers on either side of the narthex. They are up at the top, and a lot of times they are bell towers. And it's westwork because the narthex typically is on the western side of the church, facing west. I'm also pointing down below to an area above the doorway, basically, of this church. And a doorway is called a portal. And the area of sculpture work, the only real decoration you see in this Romanesque church is called a tympanum. And a tympanum is basically a semicircular sculptural area above the doorway. So a tympanum will always be in the portal, so the doorway. And usually it is in a Christian art time period communicating Christian stories, and it's in sculpture work. And it's meant to communicate to the people coming into the church who cannot read mostly. So to get the messages that the church wants to send, they're going to have those clear images in the tympanum, very big, very prominent, usually painted. This one probably was. And as you go in, you get those messages communicated to you. So let's look at that in just a bit, but first we're going to look at the floor plan, and then we'll go on to the tympanum in a close-up. The Church of Saint Foy was what we call cruciform plan, so it is cross shape. You have basically entering into the narthex, go into the nave. If you're a pilgrim, you'd most likely not sit at the service. You'd go down the aisles. As you can see, those yellow arrows. You go around the apse. The area shaded in blue is an area we call an ambulatory. And an ambulatory is a walkway. So that word is written in blue there on the slide. Ambulatory means to amble or walk around. And so again, ambulatory is a walkway. It's usually referring to a walkway that is around an apse. Then the areas shaded in red are called radiating chapels. Those usually are semicircular areas that are located off of the apse, and they are used for shrines and to hold the relics of saints and or holy figures. And so the pilgrims might go in there, visit the relics they are meant to, trying to visit, and then exit out the church. The interior then of the space is pretty dark because the windows are so minimal and the church walls are so thick that you don't have a lot of light coming into the space. So you have a really dark interior. What we call it in Romanesque art typically is compartmentalized, meaning the space is very closed off. So if you're sitting in the nave, you're basically just seeing and experiencing the nave. If you're in an aisle, you don't see too much into the nave, you don't see too much into the apse. So every part is pretty separate and distinct from each other simply because the walls, the columns, everything is so big, bulky, and supportive because the ceiling is so tall, the vault is so tall, and the vault is, or the the space in the nave is so wide to accommodate pilgrims. Now, the other thing I talked about in here in terms of the interior is you have compound or bundle columns. I'm pointing to that in the image. These are used in the nave arcade, and it's just when you have more than one column gathered together, kind of like a bulk of asparagus or something. So again, characteristics of the interior: thick walls, a dark interior. Typically, Romanesque churches have barrel vaults, and again, very compartmentalized, not a lot of ornamentation, and dark. Now here is a close-up of our tympanum. The tympanum subject matter, which ties in really, really well with the time period where you have the change of 999 to the year 1000 ACE, when everybody's thinking of, life is going to end, my soul is going to be judged as a result. So when you're going into the portal, which again is the doorway, the tympanum is directly above you in sculpture work. And the most common tympanum sculpture theme you're going to have, or narrative, is the Last Judgment, where Christ is sitting on a throne or standing there on a throne or near a throne, and he is judging you, judging the pilgrims. And if you are judged favorably, you go to heaven and are blessed. If you are not judged favorably, you go down to hell. So his right hand is pointed upward, and so that's pointing to the blessed and to heaven. His left hand is angled down, and that is a suggestion of hell and really kind of directs your eye to that region. A lot of Romanesque figures tend to look very abstracted. He does not look natural. He's much more thin, flatter. He's not even the most abstract that Romanesque art can get into. There's some tympanum sculptures of Jesus that are incredibly abstract, where he almost looks like a spider, like Jack Skellington on Nightmare Before Christmas. Something very otherworldly and fear-inspiring. This is not a Christ, like a welcoming and loving figure. This is much more intensely fear-inspiring and intimidating of a figure. So on his right are the blessed, and then down below, and I'll show you a close-up in a little bit, in the arcade of arches, I have a blue arrow pointing. You have Saint Foy kind of on her knees and bending down, and there's a hand of God right beside her. So God is represented. Saint Foy is represented, of course, as one of the blessed, as a martyr. The people below her in that arcade of arches are also the blessed. And then on the right-hand side, you have Satan and the damned. And there are all sorts of tortures going on there. People being hung, people looking very malnourished, just torturous activities going on. Just emotions are very, very over the top, and it would provoke a lot of anxiety in people. This would be taken very seriously. And the people who would be going into this church and taking these pilgrimages would just believe it and be very intimidated and want to do better and want to be faithful and want to prove their faith, so that when they are judged finally, that they will be judged well and go to heaven. So that is a tympanum sculpture. And again, in Romanesque art, quite often you are going to be seeing the Last Judgment. Excuse me. These are just some close-ups for you to look at. On the right, the damned, upper part, Christ, and the, excuse me. Christ is up above, but you're seeing down below where the blessed are, and Saint Foy and God. And then, finally, we have the reliquary. The reliquary is a holder of relics, and relics are the remains or items associated with a saint or a holy person. So this is basically a wooden sculpture, but it has been covered in gold and silver gilt, G-I-L-T. And then stones, precious stones and materials in cloisonné technique. And the head actually comes from a Roman sculpture from the past. So it's definitely spolia that the Romanesque, Christians are taking that sculpture and using its head for the reliquary for Saint Foy. So this is what the pilgrims wanted to visit. This might be in that radiating chapel off of the apse, and it would be taken out most likely once a year to be paraded around the city. And in the back, you would have this little like door, cabinet door, almost look like opened up, and the young girl's remains, Saint Foy's remains, would be inside. And it was very common for pilgrims to bring offerings to Saint Foy in the form of jewels or semi-precious stones, which would then be inlaid in cloisonné technique attached to this sculpture in order to show their faith. Remember, Saint Foy means faith. So it's an interesting kind of show of your faith to take the pilgrimage and to make the offering, and then ultimately, hopefully, you would be rewarded by being judged well when you passed. So again, that is the Church of Saint Foy, our Romanesque piece, highlighting the Last Judgment, highlighting church building that was really going on with great zest, basically, in this time period, as people being very concerned, newly concerned, and intensely concerned about their afterlife because of that change in the time period here from 999 to the year 1000 ACE.